Under the Speaker's announced policy of January 6, 2009, the gentleman from California, Mr. Dreier, is recognized for 60 minutes as the designee of the Minority Leader.
Madam Speaker, I stand for advice and extend my remarks.
Without objection.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. Let me say that I'm going to be joined by a number of my colleagues this evening to talk about an issue which often has a tendency to lead people to have their eyes glaze over. It's the issue of international trade. And I know that we have people who are focused on the World Series. I regret the fact that my two Los Angeles teams, the Angels and the Dodgers, haven't made it to the World Series, and we're all fascinated watching the Phillies and the Yankees play. We've got people focused on, as my California colleague Mr. Lundgren just pointed out, the issue of health care. We've got understandable concern about the situation in Afghanistan, and our colleague from Illinois just spent time talking about the families who had loved ones who paid the ultimate price in Afghanistan. We have a lot of very, very important issues that we are addressing here. And it's important to note, as our distinguished Republican whip, Mr. Cantor, said in his colloquy with the Majority Leader, Mr. Hoyer, that what we hear at home and what public opinion polls, and most recently the Gallup poll that came out day before yesterday, have shown is that the number one priority right now, the greatest concern of the American people, happens to be the pressing need to get our economy back on track. The report came out earlier today that the jobless numbers have in fact not improved. We know that we have an unemployment rate that is approaching 10%. My state of California, it's 12.2%. And as I said, today's report that the new jobless claims did not decline by the extent that had been thought. We did get positive news on the gross domestic product growth over the last 3 months. Annualized, it came at 3.5%, but I've got to say, and I was talking to one of my Democratic colleagues late this afternoon who said, what evidence do we have of this economic growth? And we all know, as we talk with our constituents across this country, that we have very, very serious problems when it comes to job creation and economic growth. Now, I begin by saying that our goal here this evening is to talk about international trade. And the challenge that we have, Madam Speaker, is to underscore the direct correlation between job creation and economic growth and international trade. Tragically, over the past several years, we have had people get it completely backwards. There are people who believe that as we pursue international trade agreements, that the natural step to follow is job loss in the United States. We constantly hear, well, if we pass a free trade agreement, what is it that's going to happen? Oh, we're going to see our jobs going to Mexico or to China or to any other country in the world, but they're going to flee the United States of America, when in fact the opposite is the case. Why? Well, the reason for that, Madam Speaker, is that 95% of the world's consumers are outside of the U.S. border. 95% of our consumers are outside of our border. They're not here in the United States. And the United States is a country that has provided the world access to our consumer market, meaning, as we all know, we can buy goods from China that people see regularly at Walmart, Kmart, Home Depot, stores across the country. And so we allow, virtually tariff-free, for goods to come into the United States so that the American people can enjoy a standard of living that is higher than it would be otherwise. And that's a good thing. It's a good thing. As I said, we want the standard of living in the United States of America to improve. One of the things that can help us improve our standard of living and create jobs, based on every shred of empirical evidence that we have, is for us to embark on more, not fewer, trade agreements. Basically, market opening opportunities for U.S. workers so that manufacturing workers, union members, and non-union members will have an opportunity to sell their finished products in countries around the world. It's very important for us to embark on those agreements because the existence of those agreements, and we have a lot of evidence that we're going to talk about this evening that shows that, the existence of those agreements do in fact create jobs right here in the United States of America. In fact, if we think about our goal, the goal that we have of job creation and economic growth, there are very few efforts that we have that promise more benefits if we move forward on the global trade agenda, and there are very few things that threaten our goal of job creation and economic growth if we fail to move forward on the trade agenda. So that's why I want this evening to have my colleagues who are here, and I will say that a number of my colleagues on both sides of the aisle, this was to be a bipartisan special order this evening, both sides of the aisle were hoping to join me, colleagues like Mr. Meeks, Mr. Kind, and other members on the Democratic side, and other colleagues here, because I very much hope, Madam Speaker, that we can get back to the bipartisanship that has existed on the trade agenda in the past. Unfortunately, the Democratic leadership has chosen not to move the trade agenda, and I'm saddened that President Obama has, to this point, not been able to move the trade agenda forward as it should be, because I know that he very much wants to see new jobs created in the United States, but for, I guess, a number of reasons that I find hard to comprehend, they have failed to move the trade agenda forward. But again, there are rank-and-file members on both the Democratic side and the Republican side who feel strongly about the need to do this in a number of areas. And I want to spend this hour this evening talking about those. And I have two very distinguished colleagues, my California colleague, Mr. Herger, and the very distinguished gentleman from Woodland Hills, Texas, Mr. Brady, who is here. And I'd be happy at this juncture to yield to either of the two of you if we could engage in a colloquy and discuss some of these issues. And I know that Mr. Herger, who, Madam Speaker, has served with great distinction as the chairman of the Trade Subcommittee of the House Ways and Means Committee, has been a wonderful leader in this area, and I'd like to yield to him at this juncture.
And I thank my good friend from California, Mr. Dreier, for leading us in this very important discussion on trade. And really the surprise, I think, for myself, now I represent a Northern California district, heavy agriculture, one of the richest agricultural areas in the world. It stretches from just north of Sacramento, almost 300 miles to the Oregon border. Mm-hmm. The northern quarter of it has, and along the sides, has some 9 national forests, Mount Shasta, Mount Lassen. But within the agricultural areas, as I mentioned, is one of the richest agricultural areas in the world. We grow a large percentage of specialty crops grown in the world within the United States: walnuts, almonds, prunes. We're the 3rd largest rice producing district in the nation. And the fact is that our consumers in Northern California and all of California, and one out of every 8 citizens of the United States lives in California, but even of the United States, cannot consume all that we eat. We need all that we grow. We need to be able to export. And so over half of all that we grow is exported to other nations. It helps with our imbalance of trade. But it's not just agriculture, as my friends Mr. Dreier and Mr. Brady know. it's manufacturing as well. And it's always...
If I could reclaim my time and just engage my friend,
do.
if I might, Madam Speaker. The issue of agriculture, let's spend just a moment on that, if we might, because the gentleman comes from an agriculture-rich area, and frankly, there are many people, Madam Speaker, who believe that the state of California's number one industry is tourism or defense or motion pictures. There are a wide range of areas, but they often don't get it right because the number one industry in the largest state in the Union is agriculture. And the Central Valley of California, which is going through serious challenges now that all of our colleagues know because of the water problems out there, has not been able to move ahead as we would like. The area in Northern California, which my friend represents, is a very, very rich area when it comes to in many ways, but when it comes to the agriculture field, and I know that prying open those new markets with 95% of the world's consumers outside of our border would be very, very helpful for job creation and economic growth in his district. I'm happy to further yield.
That's exactly true, and I'd like to give the example.
The gentleman's time has expired. Without objection, the 5-minute special order request of the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Gomert, is vacated. Would the gentleman wish to make a motion?
Mr. Speaker, before we do any more damage, I'd move that we do hereby adjourn.
The question is on the motion to adjourn. Those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed, no. The ayes have it. The motion is agreed to. Accordingly, the House stands adjourned until 12:30 p.m. on Monday, next for morning hour debate. Thank you. Thank you. You too.
Examples of agriculture, and then mention that the same challenges we have in agriculture we see in manufacturing as well. As a matter of fact, we as a nation are the number one agricultural country in the world and exporting country, but it's not just agriculture, it's also we're the number one manufacturer, the number one trading nation in the world. And our big challenge, as it is with our agricultural goods, is that we basically have very low tariffs coming into the United States. But when we look at our markets for agriculture and other commodities, whatever they might be, getting into the markets of China, getting into the markets of Japan, in Asia and South Korea, in the EU, Europe, is that we see that in South American countries, we see that their duties, import duties of getting our rice or our prunes or our peaches or walnuts into their country is very high. So therefore, it's very difficult for us unless we can negotiate agreements, trade agreements with these countries to lower their tariffs in order to get our goods into their country.
The gentleman, if I could reclaim my time, Madam Speaker, I would say it's very interesting that my friend raises both Asia and Latin America. We have agreements, as we know, and both of these gentlemen here, Madam Speaker, have been involved in this, have negotiated free trade agreements with Colombia, Panama, and South Korea. Those three agreements are pending right now. And we unfortunately have not had a vote here in the Congress on those agreements. In the wake of that, our neighbors to the north, Canada, have embarked on a free trade agreement with our allies in Colombia. They have already proceeded with that, in part because we have not. Our friends in South Korea have already negotiated a free trade agreement with the European Union. And so what has now happened, as my friend has referred to this high tariff rate on all of these specialty crops that would be sold in Colombia, if those things are grown to the north in Canada, they now, under this agreement that's been struck because we have been so slow in putting together our agreement, not passing it, and I believe if we were to have it here in the House of Representatives, it would pass with bipartisan support. But by virtue of that, the Canadians are able to sell tariff-free into the Colombian market right now, and unfortunately we're denied the opportunity of that, and I'm happy to further yield to my friend.
Well, that's exactly right, and our tariffs are in the mid 20% that we're as much as that we're paying into these countries. So what we see, it almost defies reason to think that we are standing still in this Congress, that we actually have the three agreements that you mentioned that have already been negotiated, the Panama, and they're about ready to build the Panama Canal, and the gentleman and myself have both been down to these countries. We've seen this. Their country wants these agreements. They want to be able to they've already negotiated bringing their tariffs down. All we need to do, they were negotiated in the last administration with these countries. All they need is a vote and an okay by the Congress.
If I could reclaim my time, let me just say along that line, the gentleman is absolutely right. Mentioning that construction, the modernization of the Panama Canal, we all know what is it that it takes to bring about modernization of the Panama Canal. Tractors, road equipment, the kind of heavy equipment. What comes to mind? John Deere, Caterpillar, other companies here in the United States that are on the cutting edge of developing great equipment, and yet the tariff rate that exists right now on selling that equipment into Panama exists, and with this agreement we would be able to get it to zero, dramatically cutting the cost of modernization of the Panama Canal, and I'm happy to further yield to my friend.
Well, that's exactly the case, and like everything else in life, no one stands still. You're either moving forward merely because your competitors are moving forward, or you're moving behind. And in this case, not only are we not moving forward with just these three agreements we're talking about that could pass, but we see, as you mentioned, as Mr. Dreier from California mentioned, we see the Canadians have also negotiated an agreement with the Colombians, with the Panamanians, where they will get in ahead of us to be able to make agreements. Their businesses will begin developing their relationships, and our businesses and our agriculture will be on the outside, looking in. We'll be behind. We'll still be paying these high tariffs where our competitors aren't, and therefore we will lose literally millions of jobs that we could have been gaining, billions of dollars in trade that we could be gaining at a time when our economy is down, at a time when we have some of the highest unemployment we've had in many decades here in the United States.
If I could reclaim my time, I think the gentleman makes a very interesting point. As I've talked to a number of colleagues about the importance of our bringing up and considering and voting on these trade agreements, I know that my friends have heard this, will hear this argument made. My gosh, we're dealing with a nearly 10% unemployment rate in the United States, and our state at 12.2% unemployment rate. Now's not a good time to bring up a free trade agreement, because aren't we going to lose jobs here in the United States if we put into place a free trade agreement? When in fact, as the gentleman has said so well, Madam Speaker, the opposite is the case, because passage of implementation of these trade agreements are job creators right here in the United States of America. I'm happy to further yield to my friend.
Well, that is exactly the case. It really is a win-win. It is virtually a win-win for almost even virtually all of our manufacturers, not just agriculture that I represent. And we're again falling behind. We're costing more jobs. We're not moving forward. And all we're asking for is a vote on these three areas. We've already negotiated with Panama, We've already negotiated with the Colombians. We've already negotiated with the South Koreans, and all we're doing is waiting for a vote up or down, and yet we have not been able to get that from this Congress.
Well, I thank my friend for his very thoughtful remarks. I made a horrible mistake earlier. I live in Southern California. There's a great area called Woodland Hills, and I know my friend is actually from the Woodlands, Texas, but I hope that he'll excuse me, and I know that there could be a worse slur than being mistaken for a California city, but if, as a Texan, maybe that's not the case. But our friend Mr. Brady has provided very thoughtful, tremendous leadership on the trade agenda. I've been privileged to work with him, and Mr. Herger and I were able to join Mr. Brady with the leadership he provided on a very important roundtable discussion that we had over at the Library of Congress on the trade agenda a couple of weeks ago, and I'm happy to yield to him.
Well, thank you, Mr. Dreier. Thank you for your leadership on trade for so many years in Congress, and Mr. Herger, former top Republican on the Trade Subcommittee of the House Ways and Means. We are here because we want jobs in America, good-paying jobs, type you can raise your family on. And today's a good day to be talking about because two things occurred today. One, Speaker Nancy Pelosi introduced the Pelosi Plan, the new national takeover of America's health care system, which we are going to spend every waking hour defeating, sending back to the drawing board and get a health care reform bill that's done right. And the third quarter economic numbers came out, how America's done the last 3 months, and it showed that it grew about 3.5%, which growth is good. But if you look at it, what you realize is almost all that growth are one-time events. Cash for clunkers, which is over, and businesses have drawn down their stockpiles of inventory. That only happens one time. Looking forward, whether we have hit the bottom or not, the question is the private sector, the private market in America going to drive our growth in the future, or is government? And the only way you have a strong recovery is if it's the private marketplace. What we are missing are jobs created by selling American products and services around the world. It's no longer enough to just buy American. We have to sell American because of what you said. So many consumers live outside our borders. We want them to buy our ag products, our services, our our computers, our equipment, all of that. But when we go outside the country, what we often find is that the rules are tilted against our companies and our workers. Other countries, China, Europe, Latin America, have reached trade agreements that give their companies and their workers an advantage over ours. And today, what's interesting, as you both said, is that when we have trade agreements, we win. We sell our American products and services. We have a trade surplus with our trade agreement partners. In Latin America, I was just thinking about in Chile, people said we would sell about 50%, about 50% more products there. We've sold 250% more American products.
If I could reclaim my time, I'd like to just underscore the point that my friend has made. We regularly hear that free trade agreements lead to job losses in the United States. That's a mantra that many people, unfortunately, are beating, when, in fact, the empirical evidence that we have, history has shown the opposite to be the case. In fact, we enjoy a trade surplus with our free trade agreement, FTA, trading partners as a whole, and we enjoy a surplus. The country with which we don't happens to be Mexico. And there's a reason for that. It's our purchase of oil from Mexico, and were it not for the purchase of oil from Mexico, we would, for all intents and purposes, have an equilibrium of trade between the United States of America and Mexico. But we do have, in other countries, a manufacturing job surplus. A manufacturing job surplus right here in the United States. So we have a surplus. More jobs are created for those countries when we export with which we have free trade agreements than with not. And so the answer to deal with manufacturing job creation here in the United States is more, not fewer, free trade agreements. And I'm happy to further yield to my friend.
And you're right, Mr. Dreier, those agreements simply level the playing field. They say if your country sells into the United States, we get an opportunity to sell our products into your country, and we have fair rules to do it. And when we compete, our companies, our workers win. They do it in ag, they do it in manufacturing, in technology, in services, in all types of goods. But, as Mr. Herger said, and you earlier, America is falling behind. This new government has taken itself voluntarily off the playing field. They've said we're not going to engage in trade right now. And while we've benched ourselves, the rest of the world is still playing this game. They're cutting agreements that favor China, Europe, Latin America, Brazil, other countries, Korea, the Asian Pacific area. They're cutting agreements and deals to give their companies advantages far greater over ours. And as a result, that doesn't just cost us sales of our products, it costs us jobs because we are so good as a country when we compete. And I yield.
Madam Speaker, I will say that yesterday I had the great ambassador from Colombia, Carolina Barco, in my office, and we were talking about the fact that Colombia has just embarked on this agreement with Canada, and they've proceeded with a free trade agreement with Canada. So now what is happening is our friends to the north are going to have a competitive advantage over us in Colombia, a market of 40 million people that we should be getting into, and we could do it very, very quickly. I'd like to talk and get into some of the details now, if I might, with both of my friends. And since I mentioned the Colombia agreement, I think that, and it's gotten a great deal of attention, it is seen as one of the most controversial in the eyes of many, and I will admit that I am very troubled. While we want to have bipartisanship, and I know there are many Democrats who are supportive of the U.S.-Colombia Free Trade Agreement, I think that one of the saddest actions taken in dealing with the trade agenda was when, for the first time since implementation of the 1974 Trade Act, we saw the commitment, and it was a commitment made for an up or down vote here in the United States Congress, denied when it has come to the U.S.-Colombia Free Trade Agreement. There still is another opportunity for us to do that. But there are a number of myths out there that I would like my friends to join me in shattering, and I'd like to share some information that I just received yesterday, Madam Speaker, from Ambassador Barco, Colombia's great ambassador here to the United States. We regularly hear about union violence in Colombia. In fact, as I listen to a number of labor leaders here in the United States, we are regularly told, and it saddens me to hear this, that the Colombian government is murdering our brothers. That's a statement that I've heard repeatedly in television and in speeches made by union leaders here in the United States. And Colombia is a country which has, I believe, in a 5-year period of time, gone through a more positive transformation than any country in modern history. Are there problems in Colombia? Absolutely. Is the situation perfect in Colombia? Absolutely not. Work still needs to be done in Colombia. But under the great President Alvaro Uribe, we have seen, again, a very positive transformation take place there. And this report of tremendous violence being inflicted on union leaders has in many ways been shattered, and many of my colleagues, and I know my friends have been to Colombia, people on both sides of the aisle have been there, but just yesterday, Ambassador Barco provided me some information of a study, an independent study that was done by the University of the Andes in Colombia, a very respected institution, and they went into a detailed analysis of violence against unionists in Colombia. Their data samples actually included the Colombian union's own data. Their information that they used for this study actually consisted of information that was provided to the University of the Andes in Colombia by the unions of Colombia. And their findings, while overall violence in Colombia has steadily declined, we've seen a decline in violence in Colombia, and we know that very well. In the last 8 years, the decline in union violence has actually been greater than the decline in overall violence in Colombia. And they went on in the study to say that there is absolutely no evidence today that violence against union members is systematic or targeted. And so this notion that we've heard that the Colombian government is murdering our union brothers, which is again a message that has come forward from a lot of union leaders here in the United States, is just plain wrong. The authors of the study had the following, and I quote, Madam Speaker, "Of course, any murder is a very serious matter. However, an evaluation of the progress made in confronting such a serious problem as violence against union members in Colombia must necessarily look at the statistical evidence. This is particularly so if the conclusions of such an assessment are to be used to block important economic reforms such as free trade agreements." So in other words, Madam Speaker, they're saying that every murder is a tragedy. We all know that. And every government has a responsibility to apprehend and prosecute those who commit violent crimes. In Colombia, the Uribe government is doing just that. But the numbers don't lie. Any claim that unionists are being targeted is patently false. In fact, the murder rate for unionists in Colombia is 1/4 the rate for the general population. In fact, I remember on our last trip there, I was there in mid-August with our House Democracy Partnership, and we had a lengthy discussion about this at what is their Attorney General. It's called the Fiscalia. And the figure that I was most struck with as we spent a great deal of time going through the analysis of violence, and specifically union violence, is that the murder rate in Colombia is tragically 39 per 100,000 for the average Colombian. If one is a union member, the murder rate is 4 per 100,000. So actually the threat is greater for someone who is just an average citizen as opposed to a unionist in Colombia. So this notion that somehow there is this planned violence against union leaders is preposterous. In fact, one of the things that President Uribe has done is he's put into place around-the-clock, 24-hour security for 1,500 labor leaders in the country because they are determined to do everything within their power to ensure that union leaders' lives are not threatened. They're doing everything that they can to protect those union leaders. And I'd be happy to yield to either of my colleagues who'd like to comment on this. Mr. Herger.
Well, as my good friend from California is pointing out, in Colombia, I think most people picture Colombia as we pictured Colombia 10, 15, 20 years ago, the heart of the narco trade, everyone fearful to go out any place, whether it be in the cities or the countryside or wherever it might be. As a matter of fact, I remember my first trip to Colombia, I believe it was in the early 1990s, literally wherever you traveled. We were in Cartagena and traveled around, and you had armed guards, you had an armed convoy that you traveled with. I was there just this last year, and you mentioned President Uribe and the incredible job that he has done in the center of the narco traffic of South America, how they've gone in and have brought in those who used to be selling narcotics and used to be part of the military that was on the side of those on the drug trafficking, brought them in, trained them. We've met, as I know you have, Mr. Dreier, and I'm sure Mr. Brady, have met with some of these young people who were part of the other side, who have come in, who have been trained for jobs, who have
the
come
demobilization is called the demobilization effort. Those from the FARC, the Armed Revolutionary Forces of Colombia, which have been the guerrillas, and the so-called paramilitaries, those on the right who responded. They've had this amazing demobilization effort where young people have been drawn into violence, and now they're so excited to be part of productive society. I'm happy to further yield.
Well, and again, as you've met with them, and we met with them not only in Cartagena, but also in Medellin. I mean, who would have thought about going to Medellin, where we did, and to see how safe it is now, and met with these same young people, people in their mid-20s, early 20s, but had spent basically their whole life on the other side, that were now productive and excited about the life in a democracy there and being able to live. It is incredibly exciting, and is even that much more of a reason when they have fought and done so much to change their countryside, have risked their lives to turn their country around, that if there's anywhere we should be an ally to, it should be there to the Colombians. So not only are they helping us with their trade, but we're in a position there to aid them, to help them, that stand as an ally with them, as we should be with the Panamanians, as we should be with our allies, the South Koreans, where again are helping us at a time when economically we need these jobs in America. This is when our Speaker Pelosi, the head of the Senate, Harry Reid, should be allowing these 3 already negotiated trade agreements to come before the House and the Senate to be voted on, so that we can be moving forward there, bringing down their barriers, selling our agriculture, selling our manufacturing goods, and putting literally millions of Americans to work.
I appreciate my friend getting back to the point of why it is that we're here. Because the number one priority, according to the American people in the Gallup poll that was released day before yesterday, is job creation and economic growth. And we've all been talking about that. We want to make sure that we can create good jobs, agriculture, manufacturing, small businesses. We want to create service sector jobs. We want to create these jobs here in the United States of America, and I believe that one of the best ways for us to do that is to open up these new markets. Now, obviously, we want to underscore concern. If governments are taking action, murdering union leaders, that understandably is outrageous. But there is a complete blur that has been put together on the part of many people who, for some strange reason, are opposed to engaging in these trade agreements that I just find incomprehensible. And it is, again, beyond me why it is that they would hurt union, rank-and-file union members who are going to be the ones to benefit by opening up these new markets. I'm happy to yield to my friend from the Woodlands.
Well, thank you for raising this issue, because I think it is shameful that America has not ratified the trade agreement with Colombia. Yeah, there are strong jobs reasons. Colombia is able to sell their products in the United States almost duty-free. We want the opportunity to compete with their customers. Canada and Europe are cutting agreements with them that will cost us about $500 million of sales of U.S. goods and services and products, which again, those are lost jobs. But the point you made early on, Mr. Dreier, is that beyond that, here's a country that has brought itself, with America's help, from darkness to light. Under President Uribe has taken a country, established rule of law, freedom of democracy, freedom of the press, freedom of the marketplace, has a judiciary that's working. They've lowered the violence rate in a neighborhood, in a region that absolutely rejects America and all we stand for, including this new president, rejecting him as well. Here's Americans' allies who is fighting with us to stop trafficking, drug trafficking, stands with us on security issues and human rights, have done remarkable things, and we've turned our backs on them. So it is whether it is Colombia and that strong national security reasons, Panama and the market that goes with that, Korea, and the rest of the world where, again, as you've said, America is falling behind. It is just a shame.
Madam Speaker, my friend makes a very, very important point on the foreign policy implications here when we talk about the tremendous alliance that we've been able to build with Colombia. Let's look at the kinds of threats that exist there. The neighborhood is a tough one. Of course, the very famous Hugo Chavez, the strong man in Venezuela. We have Evo Morales, the leader of Bolivia, who is a Chavezista. We know that, very closely aligned. Rafael Correa, the leader of Ecuador, has fallen in line in the same way. In the region, we, of course, have Daniel Ortega, the leader of the Sandinista movement there, and we have this strong, very, very strong ally of ours in Colombia, and it's amazing when you look at the numbers. It has been 1,073 days, 1,073 days, Madam Speaker, since the signing of the U.S.-Colombia Free Trade Agreement. And guess what? $2.3 billion in additional tariffs have been imposed on U.S. manufacturers, other job creators here in their quest to get their products just into Colombia alone. $2.3 billion in the last 1,073 days. And let's look at a couple of those items. Automobiles. Right now, there is a 35% tariff on U.S. automobiles in the quest to get into Colombia. What does that mean? On a $20,000 automobile that would be manufactured in the United States and sold into Colombia, the tariff would be $7,000. If we can pass this agreement, have a vote here in the House, and put it into place, what will happen? Well, we'll see that tariff go to zero. Similarly, for DVDs and movies, it's a 5 to 15% tariff. For cotton, and we know that textile manufacturing is very, very important. A lot of manufacturing takes place in Latin America. Cotton comes from the United States. Right now there's a 10% tariff on U.S. cotton going into Colombia. If we can bring that to zero, it means that more cotton in the United States of America will actually end up, Madam Speaker, going to Colombia for finished product. Now, Madam Speaker, we're very fortunate to have been joined by my very good friend from Lafayette, Louisiana, Dr. Bastani, and I appreciate his presence here and the strong leadership that he's shown not only in this health care debate with his brilliant response to President Obama after he addressed us here in this joint session of Congress, but on the issue of international trade as well, and I'm happy to yield to Mr. Bastani.
I thank my friend from California for his kind comments, and there's so many aspects to trade that we really need to discuss. First of all, if you look at our economy, where the United States economy has been a consumer-driven economy, we have seen imports vastly exceed exports in this country. And all the economists are talking about getting back to some sort of global trade balance and current accounts balance. And the only way to do that is for us to increase our exports. And that won't happen without trade agreements. I can give you some examples. From my home state, for instance, exports from Louisiana following the NAFTA agreement rose 271% since 1994. Since 2004, with the U.S.-Chile free trade agreement, exports from Louisiana rose 219%. With the Singapore-U.S. trade agreement, we saw a 53% increase in exports since 2004. Morocco, 99% increase in exports since 2006. And with CAFTA, we've seen a 43% increase since 2006. Now, the fact of the matter is 96% of the world's consumers live outside the United States.
My friend just added an additional percentage point. I've been saying 95%. Is in fact 96% live outside of our borders?
Those are the facts I have.
Thanks for correcting me.
And I think it's important to recognize that jobs related to exports pay on average 13 to 18% more than non-exporting jobs. These are benefits for families in the United States. These are benefits that create jobs in the United States. I know I walked in a little late into this discussion, and you were discussing the foreign policy implications of this, and specifically with Colombia, but I would submit that it's even broader than that, because as President Obama and his administrative team travel around to the world's capitals to deal with very difficult foreign policy problems, whether it's in Central Asia or in the Middle East and so forth, even in Africa. In these capitals, those leaders are going to want to talk about trade and expanding trade opportunities, because it all comes down to economic opportunity in the long run. And if we're not prepared with a trade agenda to move forward with the leaders in these respective areas, then our foreign policy is going to be a failure.
If I could reclaim my time for a
Yes,
moment, just to underscore what my friend is saying on this foreign policy issue, which is an important one. President Obama has, I believe correctly, talked about the importance of soft power, dealing diplomatically, which I think is important. I, of course, am a strong proponent of a tough defense posture as well, but utilization of soft power is something that President Obama has referred to. And in fact, at the G20 meeting that took place, those leaders all agreed that they would reject protectionism. But unfortunately, if you look at 66 of the 78 trade measures that have been implemented since that G20 meeting, they have been protectionist. And it's very sad, because as we're talking about the economic downturn through which we're going right now and the challenges that we face here in the United States and in the global economy, one can't help but think about history, because people are talking regularly about this economic downturn and what took place 7 decades ago, the Great Depression. And we know that, unfortunately, under Republican leadership, President Hoover and Congressman Hawley and Senator Smoot, we saw a passage in 1930 of a very, very poor trade policy. Fortunately, we as Republicans have been proudly providing leadership since then, and we want to work in a bipartisan way on this. But most economists, regardless of their stripe, acknowledge that the protectionist actions, which frankly Smoot-Hawley began as just a little agricultural tariff measure at the outset and grew into one of the most protectionist measures in the history of the United States. It undermined our ability globally to provide leadership. If you look at what happened to Europe, as we all know, following that, the Second World War, it can go back to this use of soft power question, which the President has correctly raised, and similarly at that time, engaging in protectionism undermines that. And the unfortunate thing is, we seem to be slipping down that road of protectionism now, which seriously undermines our ability to provide that strong global leadership in dealing with the war against radical extremism, in dealing with the challenges that exist in a wide range of areas. And I'm happy to further yield to my friend.
I thank my friend, and I would add that as we look at this difficult economy and the significant unemployment we're seeing here in the United States, it's important to keep in mind that 97% of U.S. exports are from small and medium-sized businesses.
I was afraid you were going to say 97% of the world's consumers are out of our borders, that it's gone up 2% since I started in 95.
That's right. Well, but here we are, and if we want to grow small business jobs, the best way to do it is to expand our exports, and that will help us also expand our manufacturing capacity. But you know, the world's watching, well, actually the world's moving forward, and we're sitting still here.
Behind.
I mean, if you look at the Trans-Pacific Partnership, everybody's waiting on the United States to move forward with this agreement. It's a critically important agreement to work out with Chile, Peru, Singapore, Australia, New Zealand, and Brunei. You know, we're also looking at the Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation, and this is where we need to be engaged with China and these eastern countries because we have huge trade opportunities and job growth opportunities by expanding these agreements. So I think it's clear that this administration needs to come forward with a comprehensive trade policy to Congress, and let's get to work on creating this liberalized trade order, because that is the element of soft power that you were emphasizing earlier, and it is probably our most important instrument of power as we move on the global stage. And with that, I'll yield back.
Well, let me say that my friend is absolutely brilliant. Not all doctors are seen as that way, but I'm so impressed that Dr. Bustani has been able to charge towards great brilliance in a wide range of areas beyond his field of expertise, and we're very fortunate to have him in the House. I'd be happy to yield to my friend who sneered when I mentioned doctors to me here, my friend from the Woodlands.
No, I was just thinking about people who are out of work. We've lost 9 million people who no longer have jobs since the recession began, almost 3 million since they passed that huge stimulus bill, who may be watching tonight to have no jobs, maybe have lost hope of getting them. Yet the companies that could hire them are manufacturing products or offering services or growing agriculture goods that they don't have an opportunity to sell throughout the world, that the rest of these countries are just moving past us, so aggressively selling, promoting their country's goods and services, and America is so arrogant that we don't even go out there and try to create a level playing field. And what I always tell people in closing for myself is that if you drive down a highway, every third acre you see planted is for sale around the world. If you go to a computer company, every fourth worker is building something for sales around the world. If you go to a manufacturing plant, every fifth worker is building something for sale around the world. And if you look at our whole economy, 4 out of every 10 workers are tied to trade. So if we can sell America, not just buy America, sell American, we can create jobs for Americans. We can put people back to work. We can improve our own economy. So what are we waiting for? I yield back.
I thank my friend for his very thoughtful contribution. And let me say, Madam Speaker, that I think one of the things that we've not really spent a lot of time discussing here this evening has been the U.S.-Korea deal. We've talked in large part about Latin America, about Colombia and Panama and the benefit of opening that up. But I do know that the 3 ambassadors representing countries with which we have signed these trade agreements have come together, and they've unified on the message that the issue of trade and free trade is a priority for all of them. And they each have unique cases to make as to what those benefits are. And frankly, as I listen to virtually all of those arguments, they are very positive for us. When it comes to Korea, the amazing thing that we look at there, if we were to pass this U.S.-Korea free trade agreement, it would be the single largest trade agreement ever embarked upon in the world because of the size of the U.S. economy and the size of the economy of South Korea. They have a $1 trillion economy, a $1 trillion economy, and it's a very, very growing market right now for our goods, and it's our 7th largest trading partner today. And we have annual two-way trade today of $82 billion between South Korea and the United States. And it happens to be, and I know Mr. Herger, Madam Speaker, will be interested in this, it's our 6th largest market for agricultural goods in the world, and our 7th largest market for another industry that's very important, Texas, and I know in Louisiana as well as California, that is the IT market. And the largest level of broadband usage in the world is in South Korea at 83%, making it a really key market for U.S. technology, goods, and services. And there's an enormous potential for increasing those already high agricultural exports, as Korea, as we all know, must import 70% of its agricultural needs. So it stands to benefit the agriculture sectors of all of our states tremendously if we were to embark on that. And nearly 2/3 of U.S. agricultural exports to Korea will become duty-free immediately with passage of this. And our agricultural products currently face an average tariff, those products going from California, from Texas, from Louisiana into Korea, on average a 52% tariff today. And again, that would be slashed, two-thirds slashed immediately, and ultimately they would get to zero. And under the agreement, nearly 95% of bilateral trade in consumer and industrial products will become duty-free within 3 years, and tariffs on almost all goods will be totally eliminated within the 10-year period of time for implementation. And the economic and job creation benefits of eliminating tariff and non-tariff barriers to trade with a $1 trillion economy would be of great, great importance, and it would be a very, very powerful display of unity between our countries, South Korea and the United States, as we work together to address, as we've said, the very important national security issues, nuclear proliferation treaties that exist, the war against radical extremism, pandemics that are there. The idea of using this soft power, as President Obama correctly says, would be dramatically enhanced if we were to pass the U.S.-Korea Free Trade Agreement. I'd be happy to yield to my friend Mr. Herger if he'd like to add to that.
I thank my friend. That is so true. People don't realize it. You know, we hear a fair amount or some about the trade agreement that's been negotiated but not voted on with Colombia and some with Panama. But as the gentleman from California, Mr. Dreier, so rightly mentioned, the big one, the biggest of all the trade agreements that we've ever negotiated is with the South Koreans. As a matter of fact, I just yesterday had 8 South Koreans who represented businesses in South Korea that were in my office, and they were describing to me how they wanted us to be able to pass this agreement, be able to have a vote here in the House and the Senate on this very important agreement, that their concern was that they wanted to do business with our American companies. They wanted to do business with us, and that the European Union, the EU, was already negotiating, was in the process of having an agreement with them, and if their agreement went through before ours did, they would lose their ability. Obviously, if they could purchase more economically from the EU, that economically is what they would need to do. And I was looking at some statistics, is that just with South Korea, not only would we not pick up that extra business, those extra jobs, hundreds of thousands of jobs here in the United States, but we would actually lose business that we already had, because we would lose part of this market to, it was estimated by staff on our Ways and Means Committee, we could see an 8% or $1.1 billion decline in our U.S. exports to South Korea. Again, at a time when nationally we have 9.8% unemployment, in California 12.2%, and in my rural Northern California district it's up around 14% unemployment. The last thing we want to do is be losing jobs.
Right.
We need to be gaining these jobs, is why it's so particularly paramount at this time that we move forward.
And I thank my friend for getting back to this issue of job creation and economic growth, which is what these agreements are about. It's about improving the standard of living and the quality of life for people here in the United States of America by not only allowing them to have access to products from around the world, but to create good jobs so that we can continue to export to those 95, 96, 97, 98% of the consumers who are outside of our borders. Happy to further yield to my good friend from the Woodlands.
Well, in 1 minute, let me just say this. I've enjoyed this discussion because it is about jobs. It's about America falling behind. But, you know, there's this principle in trade we should not forget. And the principle is, if you and I build a better mousetrap, we should have the freedom to sell it throughout the world without government interference. And if someone else builds a better mousetrap, we should have the freedom to buy it for our family, for our business. And that freedom to buy and sell and compete is just critical. And you forget, because other countries, because others compete to sell to you and I, we have a wide choice of automobiles and clothing and electronics and all. They say that by studies that we save so much money because of that trade, that competition, that most families in America can go to a grocery store once a month for free because of the benefits of free trade here in America, which is even more puzzling on raising our standard of living, why we allow ourselves to fall behind, why we're giving up on those jobs, why America isn't leading. That is a question I believe only our president can answer, and I would yield back.
I thank my friend for his very thoughtful remarks. Mr. Bastani.
Very briefly, I would say that my friend from Texas is absolutely right. This is about growing U.S. jobs and creating job opportunities for our small businesses. And as these export markets open up and that greater connectivity is created between our country and our trading partners, the standard of living goes up in those countries and those markets expand. And it creates more opportunities for our small businesses to create jobs here and to continue to export. So at a time where we're having these discussions, when this country is seeing high unemployment, we're coming out of a recession, we should be vigorously pursuing these types of agreements. And what are we hearing now from this White House? Silence. Silence. It makes no sense. I yield back.
I thank my friend, and let me express my appreciation, Madam Speaker, to my colleagues from Louisiana, Texas, and California, and to say that it's very important for us to get back to bipartisanship on this issue of trade. I've been troubled with the fact that the President has not sent up these agreements for us to consider, as I know my colleagues are, and I've been troubled at some of the decisions that have been made by the Democratic leadership. But I have to say this. There are Democrats with whom we serve who share our commitment to the issue of global leadership by expanding these trade agreements. They understand the improvements that have taken place in Colombia, where unionists are not, in fact, being murdered by the government of Colombia. They share our recognition that we could have jobs created for Caterpillar and other John Deere if we were to go into the Panama Agreement, and they understand the implications of this U.S.-South Korea free trade agreement. This is the right thing for us to do, Madam Speaker. I believe that we can come together in a bipartisan way. If we will simply have the vote here in the House of Representatives, we'll have a strong bipartisan support for the right thing. With that, I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman's time has expired.